computer. So, because if you tell people you're going to record it, you don't actually have people that show up. So we have 45 people that have taken the time to join us tonight, and we truly appreciate it. We pushed out about 1,200 emails yesterday to try to get you all enticed to come and join us. Hopefully you have taken the 3.5 hours to watch the actual session with Scott Fulkerson and Bob Luckett on the most notorious serial arsonist in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. And hopefully you've done that. I will ask the gentleman to give us an overview of it. And if we say, hey, that's in the video, then go back and watch the video, just not to take up too much time tonight. But we wanted to bring the gentleman back. We haven't done any live sessions in a while because, quite frankly, the last live session we had 10 people that showed up, and I figured there would be more than 10 people that showed up tonight, and we do really appreciate you all taking the time. I don't know how long this is going to last. It lasts as long as you want to stay, and I can guarantee you that Bob will keep us here with some really good stories. So it is all you, gentlemen. A couple of admin things really quick. If you have questions that you want to ask them, if you use the chat feature, you should be a toolbar there. Hit chat, type your message in there. I'll try my best to get to the questions, and then I'll ask them to do it. They should be able to see it. Scott, if you hit chat on yours, you should be able to see it as well as they actually ask the question. But we're also open to people unmuting themselves and actually asking the questions directly to the gentleman as well. So, I mean, we've all been probably doing Zoom for a lot longer than the last time we did a live session here. So, Bob, we talked about this before offline, but give us the elevator speech on the actual case itself and how it started, and just kick us off.
Well, first and foremost, thank everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you and answer your questions. This case for everyone is a case that lasted 22 months. I was a part of it for 18 months when the serial arsonist came to Virginia and set a fire in my town. We visited over 600 fire scenes in that 22-month period. We had over 350 viable suspects that we looked at. And there was a lot of good, bad, and ugly. And we did some groundbreaking things with DNA. The simplest way to tell you is anything that you know or have seen in TV and heard about in real life with regard to criminal investigations, we did, with the exception of wiretaps. We did static surveillance, we did rolling surveillance, we did air surveillance. It was just state of the art. And look, everybody, it wasn't all about someone being some sort of great mind. It was a room full of dedicated investigators who sat down at the table and oftentimes banged their head against the wall, and we just talked it out and we figured out the things we needed to do. And under the leadership and direction, and I'm blowing a little smoke here for the guy because he won't, of Scott, who was our case agent in charge, and he didn't necessarily all the time want to be, but with his direction and some dedication on the part of the investigators, we were able to successfully arrest and prosecute arguably the most prolific arsonist in the history of the United States. And if you would make an argument for someone else, that's fine. But I don't think that you could make an argument you're going to find anyone any more dangerous or bizarre than Thomas Sweatt. And with that, we'll open up your questions, and maybe Scott wants to add something, and we'll go from there.
Hey, Bob. Well, first
Yep.
of all, appreciate your kind words. And again, I echo the thanking everybody for taking the time out of their evenings to join in on this. I will say, when we did the instructional block, the PowerPoint a couple weeks ago, and we did not have an interactive audience, I realized how difficult it is to talk about a case or do a presentation when you're staring at yourself in the computer screen and it's being recorded. So this actually is a welcomed event that we actually have, because one of the things we've been doing for, boy, in all these presentations we've done over the last 17 years, I think one of the things I've enjoyed about it is the interaction with people just like us, investigators, people that are very interested, and their minds work similar to ours, and the questions that are asked, and we feel their energy. And it's almost like a choose your own adventure book, if you people remember those, as you're giving the presentation, because folks will ask questions and will say, hold on, that's the next slide, and good question, here's what we did next. And it's an easier way to present when you have the energy of very like-minded, dedicated professionals like the ones that are on the call tonight, that are in the room with you. But doing it to yourself, speaking to yourself on the computer screen, is very difficult. So thank you for having us on. Bob's right. He highlighted the case just like I would have. One thing I would add is that, this is truly one of those multi-jurisdictional, true team efforts that I was very, very proud to be part of for those 22 months. And we've always said that we wanted to share the story, and not because to try to sensationalize what had occurred, but to be able to share some of the issues, problems, and concerns and mistakes that we made in 22 months, so that we may be able to alleviate some of those issues, concerns, problems, or mistakes that you may encounter if you have a case similar to this. And if you haven't had a case similar to this, then I would say, you most likely at some point in your careers will, or if you haven't had one, you're going to encounter one and you just don't know it yet. So anyways, thank you for having us. I won't be able to do the introduction any further. I think we're more interested in hearing the questions than anything else.
Yeah, let me ask you guys the first question. So I had the opportunity to be involved with all the rioting in St. Paul and Minneapolis. And, we started out in St. Paul initially, and I think we had like 30 or so incidents. And then we switched over to Minneapolis, although Minneapolis had their issues had started before the St. Paul issues. We addressed St. Paul's issues first. So basically, we got to Minneapolis and we had over 150 fire scenes, 150 locations to look at, and organizing that and putting that all together. How did you all? What were you using 17 years ago to organize the multiple scenes that you guys would need to respond to?
Yeah, I'll grab this one, Bob, and you can chime in. Overwhelming, right? I mean, data that you have to deal with in the modern day riots, and categorizing and doing it professionally, and making sure you're not missing anything can be overwhelming. And it was for us as well, to the point of, we had multiple eyes, multiple times, on multiple occasions, reviewing the same information to make sure we hadn't missed anything. Back 17 years ago, technology is not quite like it is today. So we were a little more elementary or crude or basic with how we would organize our data. We did have it's called a Enquire system, which is basically a standalone extension of our case management system with ATF that was brought into the equation. And I think that although it's very, very basic, it was still better than what we had. right? So I'm a big fan of the 90% solution. At the time, that was definitely a 90% solution. It wasn't the best, but it was better than what we had. And it allowed us to organize what we knew at the time into one location electronically from multiple jurisdictions. You're talking from the District of Columbia, Prince George's County, Maryland, Fairfax County, Alexandria, Arlington. So we had multiple jurisdictions that the data was coming in from, and it allowed us to have it in one location in one like format. And it wasn't easy. And in fact, we had one of our special agents that was in charge of particularly that function, Tijuana Patty, and her job was to keep us all on track with the organization of the case, not necessarily the investigation itself, but to collect the data, review the data, and make sure the data was being inputted into a single system, so that although it was crude, we had the ability to do some querying and look for some of the similarities between cases and components and persons, people, vehicles, evidence. So we were allowed to at least organize it. And it was not just for the investigation, but it was also for the point of, we knew at some point this was going to go to court. And we'd have to have this massive amount of data organized in a fashion and a format that we'd have to be able to produce and be able to try and convict somebody. And if you're not organized, doesn't matter how great your investigation is, if you can't present a prosecutable case in a trial environment, it's all for naught. So we did our best. Again, I can't say we were perfect, but we did our best to organize it, and we'll probably go into this on further questions. But one of the things I'm most proud of, other than the folks that we worked with and the relationships that we built with all of our partners that were on the task force, was the fact that we definitely think outside the box investigatively, but we also created a process, right? And made sure that we adhered to that process in every one of the leads in which we developed, no matter where or how that lead came out. We had a process in which we would analyze that lead. We would triage that lead. We prioritize that lead. We would assign that lead. We'd analyze the data that came back from that lead. And then we had our process in place and what we would do with that lead. And I strongly believe and stand firm on this, that if we didn't have that process in place, that we wouldn't have had been successful in the catching.
Consistency is the key. We stayed consistent. We encouraged all the local jurisdictions that were having incidents to become part of that process with us. Not that we wanted to go in and take anybody's case over. In fact, we wanted to become an additional resource for them. If the case was not ours, which in many instances it wasn't, then those jurisdictions experienced a little bit extra because of the fact that the federal government had a lot more tools and resources than most jurisdictions around the country do. And so it provided them with that great resource. And they had an opportunity to bounce what things that they were experiencing off of the members of our task force. But whether our incident was small, or whether it was large, or whether it was somebody calling in and saying that they a photo looked like somebody they went to high school with 20 years ago, we remain consistent on how we handled that from the beginning to the end. And I would advocate for anybody listening that you need to do that with a big incident or a little incident. Remain consistent.
Yeah, I liked in the video that we shot with you guys, the war room. I mean, that obviously it's standard, right? You have that one central location where all that information is being collected. You're able to step in there and be absorbed. And, even in the things that we had in St. Paul, we had a war room as well, and as we started to identify, multiple suspects. I mean, what's different today that you didn't, you had it 17 years ago, but I can put a picture of a person of interest up on a wall in 5 minutes, or share it with 200 people instantly. You had to print it off and put it on a wall, and people had to come into the room. Like there's that whole.
And daily we would walk in that room. So let's say that we went to an incident and there was a red car, let's just say a red Chevelle. We could go back in that room, and as our incidents grew, remember we had 49 actual fires and an attempt, we could go to the board, and they were on sliders on walls, and we could see how many red Chevelles that we had at other incidents. But the difference, as you just said, that was inputted by an investigator on a form, and then it had to be transcribed almost by hand to a document, and then that was pinned up on this board. Whereas today, you can enter that data and probably get it on your cell phone in some sort of format in 4 or 5 minutes. We didn't have that. And it required us to go into that room almost on a daily basis to update the information in our minds. Now, we had books we had notebooks because we were bringing in
Briefing books.
8 agents, and I still have one of those books. And that's how someone that was new to the case caught up with all the information, is when they got to our door, they were assigned somebody that was already part of the task force. So that would kind of help get them up to speed, at least on the area and where they were going. And they got one of these notebooks, and they could sit down and read from the beginning up to where we were on the basic information of our case. And so within a couple of days, they hit the street kind of running. And look, there were times that we were having 1 or 2 fires a night for 6 or 7 days in a row. So when you're running from incident to incident, and you already talked about, and you had them stacked, you don't have much time for somebody that's new to catch up. So if you don't have some format, and in those days we didn't have the technology, that's how we kept everybody up to date.
Yeah. And also the fact that you're able to bring the evidence into another room as well, and lay the components and parts out from each individual scene. I guess if that happened today, we could do the same thing, or maybe, share it, virtually or digitally, I guess. So.
Well, if everybody watched the full details, we throw up there a little video of when Scott and Detective Frank Molina were interviewing Sweatt after his arrest. And Scott's actually holding those boards, and he has them up against the wall. And initially Sweatt wasn't saying that he did it. He was just listening to the amount of evidence that we had amassed against him. And it was just volumes. And that was a conscious effort on our part. When they went in there, we had boxes and boxes and boxes. Some of them were real, some of them weren't. But there was a ton of information in front of this man. And finally, after a couple of hours, he said, yeah, I'm the guy, because he knew we had so much against him that he wasn't going to walk away from it.
Yeah. And don't forget, we also wanted to make him feel as if he was the most important person in that room. And it was at that time. And by showing him the emphasis and the efforts and the lengths in which we went to get him in that room, by staging the room like it was, and by having the volumes of data and information from the investigation, it emphasized to him that, boy, these guys really put a lot of time and effort into finding me. And that was by design, because we wanted to make him feel as if he was the most important room at the time. And that's what you do when you're interviewing a serial arsonist, a serial anything for that matter, somebody with a sociopath background or mentality. You want them to be the most important person in the room at the time, so that they have the ability to, or the comfort level to be the star for 5 minutes. And that was his opportunity to finally be the star of the show for in his life, for his lifetime. He's 54-year-old man who's been waiting his entire life to finally feel as if he's had attention to him, and that opportunity was provided to him by us, and that was by design, and we believe that helped solicit the confession.
He was never hardballed by any of our staff. If we had gone in and played good cop, bad cop and got up in his face, he would have shut down. He wanted to talk. Scott and Frank allowed him to talk, and their conversations and the ensuing conversations, I used to sit with my arm around, and we would just be two guys talking, and he appreciated that fact. And it was, as Scott said, it was his time to shine. And look, I can tell you numerous times we told him, look, you're the brightest and biggest star we've ever seen in this business. And what you tell us, we hope to be able to tell to other investigators. So if we ever have to go out and catch another person like you, you will have provided us some information and insight that educates us on maybe how we could do that again. And he liked that.
Scott, in your initial interview with him, just remind us, like, how long, like, how long was that initial interview of him when he actually, goes to give some admissions of guilt or confesses? Like, how, just take us back through that.
Sure. So Dave arrest, like most arrests, right? Good plan, it gets thrown out the window. You'll learn from the presentation and most likely from Bobby's book that he was supposed to be arrested in the District of Columbia at the place of employment at his Kentucky Fried Chicken. And that was by design as well, because we wanted to get him in a place of familiarity and somewhere he felt comfortable, which we've had interviewed him at in the past. We wanted to get him there and then bring him from there to our downtown Washington, D.C. ATF office, because that would be where he'd be charged. Because if he's arrested in the District of Columbia, he'd be charged in the District of Columbia. Well, of course, and Bobby can go into more details on this, but the surveillance team that we had on him, once we realized that he was a serial arsonist, and we had the positive confirmation from the Kerry Tantarski from the Montgomery County Police Department, from his DNA matching, then that was the final piece of evidence we needed for charging documents. We had a surveillance team on him around the clock, because at that point, once we know he's a serial arsonist, we own him. I mean, we have reliability, and we even make sure he doesn't hurt anybody else. So round the clock surveillance on him while we're getting our charging documents ready. And that morning, instead of going to his place of employment, which he had done numerous times in the past, he went into Maryland. And Bobby can talk to this, but he was very evasive and elusive and almost counter surveillance conscious. And it was almost to the point where we felt as if we were burned, we were made, and not sure why and how and why that was the case. But we had that's what we were getting from the street, from our surveillance team, was that, listen, this guy, we think he's on to us. So he heads to a different Kentucky Fried Chicken in Maryland. We finally get word from the command post, which was I was at, and from my boss, Teresa Stoop, that there was an information that already leaked out there that the arrest of the serial arsonist was imminent that day. And we figured if that information was already out to the public, then potentially Thomas Sweatt might have that information as well. So we truly believe we were made. So we initiated the arrest in Maryland instead of the District of Columbia. So we had to alter our interview location. So we took him right from there to our Beltsville, Maryland office, and scrambled and had our investigative team and interview team go grab all the props we had from downtown and all those big poster boards with all the fire scenes indicated on them, and even our audio video equipment that we had in our room that we had prepped before. We had to alter it and change it on the fly, and finally get him into the room in Maryland. And like Bobby said, it wasn't a good cop, bad cop scenario. It was, we were developing rapport. We were showing him, respect that we wanted him to have. And we were really pleading for his assistance and his cooperation, and really feeding into his ego of, listen, we've been searching for you for 22 months. And we believe you're a master at your craft, and we've been fascinated to finally be in the same room with you, and we really want to hear from you exactly what you were doing and why, and that's your time to tell your story. And of course, like most, he denied his involvement, even after we were presenting different pieces of information to him, and we were doing it strategically and tactically. but every little bit of piece of information we kept producing, he was getting a little more curious as to how and why we had that information. And then about an hour later, he finally breaks down, and after denying for about a solid hour, he finally broke down, and then at that point said, you've got me. I am the serial arsonist, almost to the words. You've got me. I am the serial arsonist. And so for additional about 3 hours later, he's confessing to the fires that we had at least presented to him, that we knew of. And he was giving us in very specific detail exactly what he did, what he was doing, why he was doing it, why he chose those victims, what components he used for his device on that day, why he placed the device in that certain location. Very intimate and detailed information about how each fire was being set. And then finally, we were getting calls from the judge saying, you got to get this guy in front of me. You can't interview him any further. You got to bring him in front of us, in front of the magistrate. So we had to bring him down in front of the federal magistrate and process him. Luckily, this is pretty fascinating to me because, this is my 25th year in federal law enforcement. And even to this day, I've never seen a case, especially one that has taken 22 months to investigate and finally arrest, with so much data and so much information, and a lot of it circumstantial. We do have some physical evidence as well, but a lot of our information would have been circumstantial. To go from arrest to plea and sentencing within a 2-week period is absolutely the fastest I've ever been involved in. And we anticipated that once the arrest was made, that this would get locked up in the court systems for years, between suppression hearings and multiple delays and requests for extensions. We thought for sure discovery. We thought for sure we'd be locked into this thing for years. And within a 2-week period, the defense attorney basically said, in his words, he's got no dog in this fight. His client wants to cooperate and is fully on board to provide the information we're looking for as being the serial arsonist.
So is it part of his plea? Go ahead, Bob.
No, after 1 or 2 proffer visits with him with his attorney, the attorney said, I don't need to be here anymore. And it was just him and us then. So there is a question here from one of your folks.
Yep. So Scott, are you able to see that question as well?
So they were saying in the Discovery ID video that was on TV that it says that this case was sealed. I don't remember anything being sealed, but he was trying to save his family from further embarrassment. So he didn't want us openly talking about his motives or reasons unless we were in a teaching capacity.
Sure.
And we followed that until he started sharing his story openly with other people. And then that just kind of dissolved itself. So yes, many of the stories that he shared with me and Scott and others are in the book. And I can assure you, and I think Bill and Scott would both agree because we've been around the country talking about this, seasoned veterans from around the world, when they hear the case, sit with their mouths open in disbelief at some of the strangeness of the things that Mr. Sweatt did and how he went about doing them. And so they are quite bizarre and they are quite strange, but they are also quite fascinating.
Bob, you all rode around in a van with this guy too, right? And
we rode with him on many occasions. I think it was actually 4, and he was in Southern Maryland, Charles County. And we went in a 12-person van to pick him up every day. And we also had a chase car following so that if he at any point attempted to try to make an escape, we had people outside the vehicle. And without going into a lot of detail, I'll just say this: people waited in line to be able to get in that vehicle and ride with us because he would take us someplace and would go into extreme details on date, time, place, weather of an incident. And and people just could not believe his recall and why he would have that kind of recall. And later on, things got revealed that I think actually indicate, remember, and I'll just say this, everything that he did was about sex and power. And so knowing that going in, you'll kind of have an idea down the road why he was doing the things that he was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, he almost, it was as if he had a relationship with each one of his fires.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's how we equated it to, now listen, I haven't had 354 relationships in my life, but in his, he had that relationship with that location, whether it was through the victim that he sought out and watched for days or weeks on end or months on end, and then just set fire to their house because he had a sexual attraction to them. Then that was why he did it. But that is why the detail and the recall for him was so clear and specific.
Yep,
And
exactly.
we were amazed by it. In fact, we had the different jurisdictions that were affected, whether it be Prince George's County, mainly the Prince George's County and Fairfax,
PC.
District of Columbia, but the investigators that were in those vans with us whenever we were traveling through their jurisdictions with Thomas Sweatt, the ones that had a electronic database for and CAD reports for fire scenes, as he's discussing them in an address we'd go to, it started off vague because we would just drive by a location and he'd say, hold on a second, up here around the corner, I remember there being a red Mustang, and the person that was driving that red Mustang, for example, worked at such and such, and I followed him for a few times.
Stories in the book. The stories in the book.
Stealing the thunder. And he'd say, pull over here and I'll describe it to you. It was the fall. I don't remember exactly what year it was, but it was in the fall time. I remember, the leaves were changing and it was starting to get dark, and here's the location of the Mustang, and here's why I chose this home, and here's what the house looked like, and here's where I set the fire. And of course, the guys are on their computers, they're looking through case files, trying to find anything that had, a fire call or a fire scene report related to that location. And sure enough, there was something notated, whether we had the right call back at that point of a set fire or not. I don't know what this is.
I'm polling everybody a question while you guys are talking. So
Okay, just jumped up in front of me. But anyway, whether we had the act, whether
I'm kind of getting that way now.
So his recall was great, and that was part of the reason why we were very confident in the information he was providing us, because we were able to independently cross-reference and verify portions of his story, and then we had no reason to believe that his information was inaccurate or was being bolstered in any way. We thought the information he was giving us was fairly accurate, and that was being followed up by our investigators, almost to the fire.
There's a question in here. Do serial arsonists associate with other arsonists? Whether they do that openly or not, I'm not familiar with. I'm sure that there's maybe some dark website where these people go and talk, but I'm not familiar with it. I don't know about you, Scott.
I don't think so. Definitely not back in 2000.
Not in our time, right?
And Mr. Sweatt is 54 years old at that time, so he wasn't exactly, surfing the net. He wasn't on
the web.
He wasn't running an Instagram account and running on Snapchat at the time. But
I had a question for you. If I remember back to when you guys were doing the presentations at the academy, I think you said that Dane Wetzel had been in contact with you guys who did the Paul Keller case. How much were their experiences helpful to you guys in doing this one?
Great question. And I highlight this. I think I did it in the recorded presentation a couple weeks ago. Our thanks and appreciation for what Dane Wetzel had provided us that day. Without getting into the real specifics on it, he was in town doing some training, and we basically kidnapped him and brought him over to our shop at the Serial Arson Task Force and said, hey, here's what we got. We have got nothing. We're spinning our wheels. We don't know who the person is. We've got DNA. We've got certain scenes. Here's our processes. Here's our structure. Here's our investigative team. Here's how we investigate, old fires. Here's how we investigate new fires. Here's our response to these new fires. Here's how we handle our evidence. And we said, look, we're looking at him like he's our dad, saying, what can we do differently? Help us out of this nightmare. And, Dane graciously said, listen, what you guys are doing is spot on. In fact, he even said that what we did, now remember, his Paul Keller case only lasted about 30 days, right? So they ran hard and heavy for about a 30-day period, but then they were done. He's like, you guys have been doing this for, I think at the time it was well over a year. He's like, you guys, I can't believe the effort and the amount of work you're putting into this task force. So he goes, this is fascinating.
We had way more stuff than they did, and he was amazed by that.
But what he did, he was like almost an affirmation for us. He said,
Yep.
You will find out this person. You will absolutely catch this person. And when you do find out who the person is, it's like a big puzzle. It's that one little piece. And once that piece falls into place, you're going to know who the person is. He goes, and he describes him. He says he's going to be a sociopath. There's going to be something either physically wrong with him or a societal issue with him, because he's a sociopath. He's a serial arsonist. And when it happens, it's going to be 100 miles an hour when it happens, meaning you have to have your details and your facts and your probable cause running in place, because when it happens, it's going to be so fast, you won't have time to prepare for the charging documents. You won't have time to prepare for the search warrants. You won't have time to prepare for the actions that needed to take place in order to put him in custody. You need to prepare right now. And he also recommended, putting together an interview team well in advance of when this person is caught, and gave us some information and some techniques to use on how to interview whoever the person may be. But basically he was teaching us how to interview a sociopath. And
Here's a point, and not to cut you off, Scott, but our interview team, look, we all dressed down, we wore plain clothes, we were chasing them, we're on fire scenes all day long. But those of us on the interview team, we all carried a coat and tie in our car. And we did that so that when we went in, we looked professional and we had an air of professionalism with us. Again, that might seem minor to many of you, but again, consistency in how we performed, and across the board, we did that. And that's important. And it worked. There's another question in here. Did he want to brag and tell his story about once he was caught? Maybe he did, but he was not somebody to jump out and do that. If you asked him a question, he did it. And he kind of did it in a rather matter-of-fact way. It was never boasting. It was just talking about it. And then somebody else asked the question, did he have a diary? Well, he said he did, said he had a scrapbook, and said he had mementos from most of his fire scenes. But when Scott and Frank went to his place of business to initially interview him, he said he got scared, and he said he threw those away. Now, here we are some 15 years later. I'm not convinced that he threw them away, but I would think in that period of time, there would be something that would have come out about where they were or where he hit them or somebody in his family. So maybe he did. I think they're still somewhere.
No, he did, Bob, just to follow up on that. He did have multiple videos.
Oh yeah.
And they were
75 to be exact.
8mm videos. So he had a 8mm video recorder that was secreted or I guess hidden and concealed in a little tote bag. And then the tote bag had a hole cut out of it so that the camera could come out. And he carried that around and he videotaped a lot of his victims, whether it would be those he was attracted to on the bus, or whether it was victims going in and out of homes. But he videotaped them. So he was preying on them, on the victims, for well before the time she set fire to their homes. And we did have to review and look at a number of those videos, and that all added to his story, to what he did and how he did it and why he did it. But there was, we do, I think I do believe that there was some form of a written, I don't know if I want to call it a diary, but at least some thoughts and some notes about his mindset and about why, and almost like a,
It's like a manifesto, if you will.
yeah, probably not as organized and as detailed as one, but just some
Right.
thoughts that he would write down as to why he did what he did at a certain time in his life. And when relationships were being positive, he probably had some positive notes in there. When relationships went bad, notes got probably deep and dark. And that's when he probably talked about some of his victims and what he did and why he did it. And we did not find that. But he did tell us that he had disposed of that, just following our interviewing him for the first time when we didn't arrest him, and obtaining his DNA as part of our process. And just following that, not only did he get rid of the diary, but he also admitted to having incendiary devices that were in the back of his trunk at the time that he went home and actually tossed those in the dumpster behind his apartment complex. And by the time we got to him, within probably what do you think? I think it was at about a 72-hour period later, that the dumpster had obviously been emptied out, and we couldn't find them at that time. So,
Hey, guys, let me ask you another question that's been posted here. It says, any suggestions to the future task force members regarding topic strategies, which you guys have kind of touched on, but that could actually derail the task force, or like any fatal flaws?
Look, let me try to answer it from a local fire marshal point of view. And here's what I'll tell you. When we would bring somebody in so that they could get, that they would become a United States federal marshal, so that we would be able to go all over the country and down to wherever, that's a process that takes a lot of time. And I would tell you, if you have the opportunity to get some people within your unit sworn now, and get them sworn in as a United States federal marshal, you should consider that. That's number one. Number two is, if you're not training with your federal partners locally, you need to begin to do that. And if you're a federal person that's listening to this and you're not training with your local partners, whether it be law enforcement or fire, that you need to do that. You should not be waiting until you have some incident where you're trying to get together. We take for granted a lot of times, just because someone's in law enforcement or someone's in the fire service and they have training, that we all do it the same way. And the fact of the matter is, that's not true. And if you take that for granted and you go to try to do something, either you're going to screw it up or somebody's going to get hurt. And the last thing I'll say to you is, don't be afraid to require people to sign documents when they come on board. Look, there was leaks, there was information leaks. And if somebody wouldn't come on board and sign some sort of paperwork about the professionalism, decorum that they needed to show when they were part of your task force, I'm not real sure that you'll want them. I'm not sure you're going to fully overcome that, especially now today with social media out there. It only is going to make your jobs harder, but you have to think about that ahead of time. And the other thing is, when something like that comes up, you can't let that be the driving force behind your investigation. There are times when you bring 50 to 60 Class A personality people from fire and law enforcement together, they're not always going to get along. But if you allow that to control what you're doing and not doing your job, that's going to derail you. And luckily, we had some people that allowed us to vent and then said, okay, you vented, now move your ass forward. I'll say it, Scott, no problem.
Bobby, I'll emphasize one of your points I'm going to emphasize is, whether you are a Fortune 500 company, Microsoft, Apple, Starbucks, you name them, those companies are successful because of relationships, right? Yep. So we are no different in the public sector and in the law enforcement community, the fire community. I just don't think we recognize it as much as we should. But our successes, and I'm a huge proponent of task force environments. I believe that more resources, the better. To get the right people that have various different experiences and skill sets together to accomplish the goal is the only way to accomplish the goal. And you have to have those relationships in place. And I would not be waiting upon the big event to develop those relationships, although it seems like we were very good at developing relationships when big ones happen, because you're thrown into a very very critical crisis scenario that you have to rely on your training, and then have to come into contact with people and work with them for an extended period of time, and making some very
We're all good when the shit's hitting the fan, because
Absolutely.
we're all trained to do the job. So we do it, we forget about personalities. But when you have something that stretches out for a long period of time, those other problems tend to creep up. And so you've got to work on those relationships now.
Yeah.
Anything, somebody said anything that we learned not to do during the case. Well, I would tell you there's probably a lot of things that we learned not to do, but they're not always easy. And that is, we all answer to bosses. And when you have a major case like this, everybody wants to be in the know. And sometimes people can't be in the know. You have to give them the vanilla version. And that's not an easy job for any of us. So maybe Scott could address more of those things. I was a worker bee. I was just out there trying to knock on doors and do the job. And he was the one that was sitting in the Eiffel Tower saying, these poor bastards, I got to help them out. I'll need to do X, Y, and Z.
Is the question what pitfalls we encountered, Bobby? Is
Yeah.
that what
This is anything that you learned not to do during the case.
Boy, I would say we probably had more mistakes than we had successes. But I would emphasize, don't be afraid to make those mistakes, right? Because you have to, and paralysis by analysis is, you can't work like that. You have to take action, and you got to make decisions based upon the facts that you have at the time. And it may be a decision that might not be, again, the perfect decision, but it is a decision, and it is an action that you are taking for the benefit. And as long as you're doing it for the right reasons, right? And as long as you have, and you're analyzing the facts, and you're making those decisions for the right reasons, then be confident in that decision and go with it. But also, don't be afraid to admit your failure, to admit your mistake, and then alter that decision and take another path. And that's what we did for 2 years.
Yep.
If I could tell you, we were, by no means do we have the playbook, and that we should say that, because we are great and phenomenal investigators, that's the reason why this guy was caught. It was because we just problem solved. So as a group and as a task force, the problems were daily. Every single day we ran into problems and concerns and challenges. And we had the type of people, men and women, that were assigned to this task force that were the right mentality and had the right motivation to be there, that there was not a challenge that we didn't feel like we couldn't overcome. And we did it together, and we did it as a group. And it was pretty special, especially at the end. They always say you want to be able to lose with the people around you as well as win, right? So we had many more losses than we had wins in this case. And we still enjoyed the people that we worked with. We still appreciated what everybody brought to the table. And we knew at some point this person would be caught, but we had to go through and encounter a lot of negativism, and a lot of failures before we were able to actually get across the finish line. And learned a lot throughout it. Things that I've been able to take into my career and apply to, every other case that I've been part of since then.
Here's an interesting question, and we can address it. Stephen asks, when the three brothers came home, and the device that was not started, he's kind of wondering how come those guys didn't run after him or catch him, and did they chase him or not catch him? Just a little bit of a background here. Remember, this is Washington, D.C. These fellas lived in not a very affluent neighborhood, and you wouldn't confront people too often there without the worry of somebody pulling a gun and probably shooting you. So when they pull up, Sweatt walks up to he approached them, and they rolled their window down and had a brief conversation. He was asking about for somebody, and they said, no, we didn't know that person. And Sweatt walked away. Now, these guys were savvy enough that they said, well, we're not so sure what this guy's going to do or what he might do. So they decided to square the block and figured they'd catch him coming back around the other way. Now, they further decided maybe we better do this pretty quickly. So they cut down an alley right behind their house, and they went around the block. And when they came out, he was nowhere. Now, their home was directly across the street from a elementary school and from a park. So it provided him with a great means of escape. And many of our scenes were similar in nature to that. So they didn't chase him. And you end up asking at the end of your question, did any good evidence come from that? And in a word, yes. And we actually found a hair in one of the bags that were there. And I don't want to go into all that detail because I don't want to ruin my book for you. But we were able to get nuclear DNA from that hair, and that aided us. So yes.
Hey, you're gonna mess up the test question if you start bringing up nuclear DNA.
I know.
Don't mess up the test question. Hey, so let's talk about the evidence. And I'm going to get back to there were some fires in Boston in the 80s. So let's talk about the evidence. Can you talk about the evidence collection and who chose which agency to collect it, and eventually what happened to all of the evidence?
Sure. So we went back, we mentioned earlier, one of the things we're most proud of is that we created a process, right? And within that process, we had lanes that our investigators stayed within, and we had a team that was designed. That's their role, was the evidence team, right? So as part of the evidence team, they would go back and review the evidence we currently had. They would go back in time, because we knew that this serial arsonist did not just fall out of the sky in the summer of 2003 when we started investigating them. They'd go back into time and try to find other cases that may not have been solved that could be related to the investigation that we were working. And on top of that, they developed a process that when they got to a future scene, right? So we were, Bobby, how many fire calls did we run on in the 2-year period? I know you have those numbers.
We actually visited 688 fire scenes, but we responded to 800 or 900 incidents over the course of that. So it was a lot.
Right. So, we'd basically be interested in the ones in which there was a structure fire, and most of the time they were occupied. And we would, without a question, would respond to those, or if a jurisdiction would ask us to come out and take a look at the fire scene. And when our evidence team got there, they got so good at what they were doing, and they knew exactly what they were looking for because of the type of evidence that remained on these scenes, that within 15 minutes of being on scene, they would know and be able to say, I think this is one of ours. And again, and then without getting into the real details, but this wasn't done just overnight. This was, months and months and months of analyzing data and working with our laboratory, working with the fire research lab, and doing test burns of these devices that were being utilized, and seeing what remained and how much liquid and gas was being used, and what part of the device remained and why, and what that part of the device looked like. All these things that, it sounds simple now, but when you don't know what you're looking at, it's not simple. It's an unknown. And our evidence team did a phenomenal job. And Captain Hoaglander at the time from Prince George's County, and one of my partners, Tom Daly, that was what they did every day, all day, was review evidence. And when they got to scenes, they responded and knew exactly what to look for. And they were able to help the investigators with the evidence they collected, working with our laboratory. And Ray Cook was one of our chemists assigned to the case. And he was, the sole chemist looking at our devices, that they would give us investigative leads. And then we'd be able to run down leads as a result of the evidence that they were able to recover.
We never pushed an agency out and took over. Never. What we did is we stood beside them and worked with them. One, so that we remained steady on our chain of custody. And two, so that if the incident was not ours,
right,
they still were in a seamless process. They just had a different laboratory looking at their evidence for them. So we worked in partnership wherever we went on all of those incidents, as instead of just maybe one or two investigators from someplace looking at it, now there was probably 5 or 6 sets of eyes looking at it, and they worked together and they talked about it.
Yeah.
And it became a seamless process because of that, and because of all the work that we did. When they got there, they could see what they needed to do, and we had all the materials and tools, and we just worked with that agency and got it done and shipped to the lab.
Yeah, we convicted a number of other
Yes.
arsonists as a result of the 2-year work that we did with our state and local counterparts.
Yep.
And look, if you're seen on your jurisdiction was eventually linked to the serial arsonist through evidence, we gave you the official invite. You are welcome to sit at our table and be part of the task force. And you had just as much buy-in and say as to how that investigation went, because your jurisdiction was also affected. So a true task force scenario, a true, it had some command and control that obviously had to be in place. But if you were affected and your jurisdiction was affected, you had a seat at the table, and you were making decisions and offering input, and shouldering into the investigation just like the rest of us were.
And to just go one step further, the investigation side of it, again, we tried to stay in our own lane. That was my section. And we did everything the same way at every incident, whether it was going to check for videos or small purchases of gasoline in areas, how we would canvass an area within 1 to 2 block radius, and how we would do that, the questions that we would ask. I actually carried all of the forms and everything that our people used, so that after each incident, we would get together before we would go out and begin to do that and begin to do our canvas and interviews. And it was fresh each time they went, but it was done the same identical way. And then we would come together as the supervisors, and the evidence section would say, well, we got X, Y, and Z. The investigation section would say X, Y, and Z. And Scott would say, okay, now we're going to do A, B, C. And we did that every single time. And it worked.
So there was some,
Go ahead.
there was some,
Let me flag this one. There's a question because I want to make sure we hit it. Randall Patton asks, you were emphasizing that relationships and interagency cooperation are very important. Did you run into any resistance from local officials initially? If so, how'd you deal with that? So look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We had relationships with some of our counterparts locally prior to this investigation, which is great because you already know who you were already dealing with people that you had broken bread in the past with and had already worked scenes with. But there were other agencies that we did not work that closely with, and that wasn't just it wasn't because we were trying not to. It's just we hadn't encountered them in the past on a frequent basis. So there was a lot of resistance, and sometimes the federal government and ATF gets that bad rap. I hope we don't, but it can be perceived as hey, federal government, we're here to help, and give us everything you got. We don't operate like that, and hopefully you don't have that experience in the jurisdictions that you're in. We value our close relationships with our state and local counterparts, and like I said before, if we work side by side and in lockstep with our state and local partners, and that's why we're successful. But I would be lying to you if I said that we didn't have any resistance throughout the case, and we did. and I'm sure Bobby touches upon that in your book. There's your
There's my plug. There's some in there.
So, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, relationships are relationships, right? Good and bad. They are what they are. Type A personalities, different motivations for different people. At the end of the investigation, I will tell you this, that the people we had on the task force were people I would go to war with. And we had the right people on that task force in 2005. That wasn't always the case. And we definitely had some strained relationships and some conflicts within the task force that had to be dealt with at different periods within the case. And we dealt with them successfully. And, we were able to overcome those. And the goal at the end of the day was getting a very, very bad person off the street just so he wouldn't hurt or kill anybody else in the future. And the people that were, how we had to get to that point, wasn't pretty. And like Bob will tell you in the book that there's some conflicts that might cause you to scratch your head in disbelief, but we overcame them. And that's just life. That's just people. That's just relationships. That's how people are designed. We're humans, and you're always going to have those conflicts, and you just got to get through them. That's all.
These fires in Boston in the 80s. You guys familiar with those, or
Sure.
did anyone communicate with the agents from the Boston fires in 1980? Tactics, thoughts, methods.
Bobby, I'll just really quickly just talk. At the time of our case, bomb arson tracking system BATS was around, but it was in its infant stages. And the more data that's in there, the more useful that system, that program is. Unfortunately, at that time, the data and the information was not very robust, so it was not very useful to us in 2003. So our method of sharing information and researching other like devices or characteristics was word of mouth. And we didn't feel as if our case took us all the way up the East Coast into the Boston region. So, if unfortunately we didn't have the optics on our case having any crossover or similarities to the Boston fires, although they obviously it was a very intricate and complex investigation in Boston as well. There just wasn't any crossover at the time. We did have like groups like you are here, IAAI, local chapters, information sharing. That was the way we originally communicated, and it shows tried and true. Again, that's that relationship piece. You got to be out there talking and communicating with your partners and sharing information, and hopefully those linkages start to occur. And that happened in this case early on. That's how we knew we had a serial arsonist.
A little side note, I'm working on a little special project on geospatial stuff. And I can tell you, if you're not putting into BATS, please put into BATS, because there's some really good next level stuff that's coming out with all the geospatial stuff. These guys at our headquarters are
Killing it.
They are killing it. There's some really cool, big data type stuff coming out that's going to be pretty neat to see if you're not using BATS. But did Sweatt have any remorse for his victims at all?
True remorse or fake remorse, I guess I don't know. I think you're dealing with if you look at a sociopath's makeup, right, is although he did want to show his concern and remorse for the victims, was there a reason for that, or was it true, and was it meaningful, or was it just for the fact that he was caught? I always question the remorse of people.
His victims were just collateral damage. He was more worried about feeling good about himself, and if somebody got hurt or killed, as Scott said, yeah, he said some things to us that may sounded remorseful. He even gave us an apology, but he openly admitted that he really didn't think about what was happening outside of satisfying his sexual needs and feeling better about himself. Period.
Nor do
And
I
again, it
believe-
wasn't boasting, it wasn't being mad, it was just matter of fact.
And do I believe that he would be still committing arsons to this day if we didn't catch him? Absolutely.
100%.
Absolutely.
Were there any red flags that came up, like any of his coworkers or anybody that might have noticed it, or maybe in retrospect, once he was identified as the guy, anyone come forward and say, hey, like,
Exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
Everybody could not believe that this pillar of the community who helped people, who took people home, who took in the homeless, who kept his neighborhood clean, could be this person. So no, not at all.
Have you ever, Billy, have you ever heard anybody say when they interview the neighbor of that serial killer, they're like, I knew he was a killer the whole time. You never hear that. And it's amazing that they're able to live lives.
And they never said that they thought he was weird or he was a loner or, any of these sometimes things on the edge that you hear, but they had nothing to say negative about the guy.
any input from the profilers at all before he was caught?
Input how? I mean, they pretty much nailed, how he was and said that, how he was going to act and what he would be doing and why he would be doing it. And, they visited the scenes and, it's told us that they thought before we knew that the person was probably African-American because of a lot of the neighborhoods that we were in. And this guy could walk unassuming in his neighborhood and nobody would suspect anything.
Sure. And then did any geo, I guess, geo profiling?
Yeah, sure.
Was that done initially, or has that been done like since he confessed to, all these fires? Have we put an analysis back to that at all?
So, Bill, we did a geo profile and a behavior profile early on in the investigation, and Ron Tunkel did the behavioral profile. And the bullet points you've probably seen on the slide is the person may use alcohol, the person may drive recklessly, he may have failed relationships, live a more carefree life and secretive life. All those things we laugh at because you're like, well, that's pretty basic behavioral profile, right? In fact, after Tunkel read that to us, we're all looking around the room as task force officers, and we're like, crap, that's us, right?
That's half of us, right? Yeah, exactly.
Drink too much alcohol, live a secretive life, are careless. You're like, well, it's us. So, so did that absolutely point the finger as to who the person was? No, but as much as we laughed at that profile, in the end, you're like, dang, that's exactly what he was, right? And those things are spot on. And as far as the geo profile goes, although again, it wasn't like the magic bullet that got us to Mr. Sweatt. What it allowed us to do was just organize the early fires that we had. The only problem with our geo profile was you really need to know where the initial fires are, right? That gets you closer to his location, because anybody is more comfortable with their surroundings that are close to either their residence, places where they work, places that they're familiar with. They're more comfortable in those areas, and that's where they act out first, right? Because they're more comfortable. Unfortunately, we didn't have the 25-year fire setting history to use as data points. So we get into it, 23 years into his fire setting history, and we go with where his fires are currently. So his comfort area had grown and had expanded. But if you look at it in retrospect, now, the northeast quadrant of the District of Columbia was a hunting ground for him. I mean, that's where Miss Luetta Jones perished. That's where the bus barn was. That's where, Sid's Liquors on the 50 car fires were. I mean, that's an area in which he had spent a lot of time. And that's where he was the assistant manager of the Kentucky Fried Chicken for, what was he, 12-year period. So he was definitely comfortable with that area. And then also in that Southeast DC area where he resided, we had a string of fires, but they were from a long time, and we just didn't know where that started. So both resources, geo and behavioral, I will absolutely give plugs for. Did it allow us to catch the person? No. But again, it's just more data points and more intelligence that allows us to kind of frame our minds as to the person we're looking for and the area we're supposed to be looking for them in. So then when it all comes into place, like Dane Wetzel said, it's like that puzzle piece drops, and you're like, whew, there it is. That makes perfect sense. Of course he works at Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's
We're going to add to that, Bob.
No, not at all.
I want to hit this other question here. As far as a cooling off period, how long was his longest cooling off period?
4 months. Is that right, Bob?
96 days, maybe something around that, and we had two real long periods where he did time like that. And an interesting note, when he came back from both of those cooling off periods, he went back to the same neighborhood to set his first fire when he came back.
And how close was that to where he was actually living?
It wasn't.
No.
I mean, as the crow flies, it wasn't.
Mhm.
Understand that if everybody's not familiar with the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, you have the Beltway. And the Beltway makes a circle around all of these jurisdictions. So traveling the Beltway, you're not far, especially if you're traveling at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. But as far as mileage is concerned, both of these fires were in PG County, Maryland, and he lived in the District of Columbia. So why he went back there?
Hey, 2 other points I'll make on that cooling off period. One, from an administrative aspect, having to do resource allocation on a daily basis. The cooling off periods, those months in which we did not have fire activity, were very difficult for the task force. Very difficult. And as sick as that may sound, as long as nobody got hurt, we wanted more fires, right? Because what does more fires give us?
Get caught.
More evidence.
Yeah, more evidence.
More, more opportunities for him to slip up and get caught, right? So those time frames in which there was these big long delays were tough for us, because we felt as if we were spinning our wheels getting nowhere. And in addition, as one of the hats I had to wear was, briefing the command staff from all the jurisdictions that had personnel assigned to the task force, and pleading with them to keep personnel assigned to the task force. And then, because of course, their response is, well, look, he must not be around here anymore. Look, there's no more fires. It must be over. Or we knew in our hearts and our minds that this was not the case, and he was going to strike again. It's just a matter of time. But as if you're a chief of police or a chief of fire, you're like, hey, look, I got bodies dropping in my jurisdiction. I need my investigators. I need my good people back. I'm pulling them back. And one of our jobs was to make sure that that was not the case. And we had to fight for those resources to stay and finish the job that we started. And the second point I'd make on that was that in the mind of Mr. Sweatt, was the reason why he had those cooling off periods was because he had a successful or a positive event that was taking place in his life during that time frame. Okay. So the majority of the time that was going to be, although what a positive relationship to him might not be the same definition to us, but he was having a relationship, a normal relationship that was taking place during that time frame, and the urge and the need to act out wasn't as strong, and he did not have to satisfy those urges with setting fires. So that's from my understanding from talking to him as to why those sabbaticals in his fire setting had occurred.
Thanks. It looks like you hit Bill Bellevue's question there. Did he admit to any mistakes that he made?
Well, Bob, you want to talk about how his device graduated or progressed through the years? I guess that probably is.
Well, he started out using quart containers, and he started out by using gasoline at various levels, but he was very much afraid of getting burned. And eventually he progressed to the 1 gallon jug. If you will, in easiest terms, he used a modified Molotov cocktail is how we talked about it. His jug was plastic as opposed to glass. He didn't take his wick and stick it through the top. He actually wove it through the handle. And through our test burns and things, it would be a very slow burning, flickering like a candle almost, and would burn anywhere from 12 to 28 minutes before the container would fail. And of course, the fumes are what was burning. And believe it or not, the level of fuel, the gasoline that he had in those containers act as a cooling agent for that plastic. And so really that's why we always ended up with that circular pattern that had a good piece of that plastic still there, because the gas was actually cooling it. So he started out, remember, as most people did, setting brush on fire and then progressed to automobiles. He would slash their tires, and then eventually he moved to buildings. So, you know, when we first got into this case, we were only experiencing single family residential fires, and then we ended up having apartment building fires. And then he moved from DC and Maryland. He came to Virginia and he set a fire. And then he set a fire in the middle of the day. And then in between, we were getting building fires. We were getting automobile fires. And so it kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And we were scratching our head on how the hell we were going to keep up with it, quite frankly. We knew he just wasn't every few days going out and setting a building on fire somewhere, that there had to be something else that was helping him with his urges. And that's how we got onto automobiles. And, you know, and he started that as a very young age, and no matter what he was doing, he never got really that far away from vehicle fires. So he was setting buildings on fire, but he was still setting cars on fire too.
How was he setting his cars on fire, Bob? What was he using? The same device?
Same device,
Okay.
and he was putting it in a wheel well, generally on the driver's side, and setting it off. And then of course he would go away. He was a guy that went to a scene, watched his work, masturbated, he would leave and then come back to a scene. So when people talk about, should you go back to the area after the fire and do they come back and look at their work? The answer is yes, you better. I mean, our policy was we go back the next night, we'd go back the next week on the same day, and we go back the next month. And believe me, there are times that your investigators are going to say, what the hell am I doing going back, standing in the street at 3 o'clock in the morning to flag down cars when we're getting the same things from these cars? You know, there's the newspaper men are out, the milk delivery people are out. But the bottom line with that is that you have to do it. We made cases for other people, but the first time that you don't do it, something drops through the cracks and somebody gets away. So you have to do it.
Was he just
I mean, look-
randomly selecting the vehicles, or was he Was he looking at the owners of the vehicles and then?
Yeah, for all those, all of the above. And again, I don't want to give it away, but yes, for that reason. Remember, everything he did was about sex or power. If he saw people on the street and heard them talking and he thought that was a sexy voice, that person became a target.
Hey, Bill, to back up that point that Bob made about going back to scenes and watching people around, he was watching us, right?
Yeah,
So,
buddy.
and multiple occasions, he would say, "Hey, I saw you guys at the 7-Eleven. I was, or I went into to that diner when you guys were eating, and I saw you guys there, and I knew what you were
I
doing.
served you in my restaurant.
I served you the Kentucky Fried Chicken." I mean, he was watching us more than, well, clearly we weren't watching him up until 72 hours of his arrest, but he was watching us for 2 years. So yeah, big cat and mouse game for him. Absolute cat and mouse game.
Yeah. I think we've answered Robert and Bill's questions there in the chat. If anybody else has any questions, you can either post it or you can unmute yourself. Anything else that you guys want to add? So we've referenced the book. I want to spotlight Bob here.
Please do.
We can see there's a book over his right-hand shoulder, and it's called Solving for X. So to give us the elevator speech on your book there, Bobby.
So it's Solving for X, Tracking the DC Serial Arsonist, an inside look at the investigation that captured Thomas Anthony Sweatt. In the back of the book, there's lessons learned. So many of the things that you folks have asked tonight, the good, the bad, the ugly, is in there. And it's from the day that investigation started to the day we were able to lock him up and beyond. Scott and I and Tom Daly were sent to Terre Haute, Indiana to visit with him and talk to him. The results of that, there are going to be some interesting stories, some that you're going to laugh about, some that you're going to scratch your head about. But here's the deal, folks. Most of the stuff that we get in the investigation field is anecdotal information in a book, and you're getting the opportunity to have information from someone that's been there on the inside, just as you're being able to get that tonight and talking to us too. That's invaluable. You can't get away from it. And what's the popularity of the book going to be? I don't know. But if people like true crime, this is it, and it's to its fullest. And I hope that you'll visit robertmluckett.com and get yourself a copy.
And we posted it there in the chat.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, you betcha. And in full disclosure, Bob and I were in the Law Enforcement Academy. I was his second round. I went in 2002. I think his first was in 86. So I was 14 then.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Everyone, I'm not sure if you know this or not, but when Bob Toth with our 7th or 8th session, Bob Toth, as you all know, is the current IAAI president. We tried to compensate him for his time for giving back to Dakari. And ever since Bob Toth, a lot of the government guys can't take money for their sessions. And what we've been able to do is make donations on behalf of the speakers that we've had come forward. So the two gentlemen tonight, Bob chose the Maryland chapter of the Concerns for Police Survivors organization. So Dakari's made a $100 donation on your behalf, Bob, to that organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And for Scott, Scott selected the Gary Sinise Foundation, which is also the same foundation that Bob Toth had chose as well. But we've given to an epilepsy foundation, a burn foundation. We've given to CFI Trainer. So we've had a lot of government people on here that just can't be compensated. And we've been able to do something on their behalf for taking their time here. So as you know, all these things are free. We are supported by the Dane County Fire Chiefs Association. And they give us an annual budget to do in-person training. And with COVID, we went virtual in April of 2020. We're up to 21 sessions now. We have a Internet of Things class that I just recorded the other day. I did one today on community risk reduction. with another fellow coworker of mine, Joe Powers, in Charlottesville, Virginia. Not our typical topic, but it's fascinating to me. And Joe had the time, so we recorded that, and we'll make that available shortly. Also, we have Andy Cox. If you know ATF, you know Andy Cox, and he's super. I think he's
Part
the
of our
best
task force. Great guy.
He's the best CFI that ATF has. So
Good.
he
Yeah.
is his damage dynamics, as you know, are in 921. We're actually flying him out here to Madison. If you know anything about anything that I've done in the past, video related, it was all done by a chief with the Middleton Fire District. His name is Chief Aaron Harris, who has a background in video production. All these pictures back here are with Aaron, and he has agreed to videotape Andy Cox's. So instead of it being a basement production, it's going to be pretty sweet. So we're hoping to do that in December. So we'll have that available to you all as well. If there are any other questions for the two gentlemen, also Bob, another friend of ours, his name is Robbie Dawson. He has a podcast, and it's called Firehouse Log Book. So I'll type that over here in a second. It's going to be featured on Monday, I believe, is when Robbie's going to release that. So you can hear, the podcast that Bob recorded with Robbie Dawson as well. Firehouse Log Book. He has more than 20 podcasts there, and they're pretty awesome. So anybody else have any other questions? Anything, Bob or Scott, that you want to add here as we wind it down?
The only other thing that I would point out to anybody is, look, if you get into this, or when you get into this, don't forget to rely on the people that have been there before you. Reach out to guys like Scott or to Bill and ask them for their advice. You can reach out to me. I'm not, I'm a retired old guy now, so I don't get to come and play as much, but people that have been down the road before can give you a fresh set of eyes and give you some insight that maybe you're missing because you're so consumed with what's in front of you. And I think that that's really important. And the only other thing I'll say is to be able to talk to 50 people tonight for the last hour and a half has been a real honor for me. And I appreciate you guys and gals for coming out and giving up your time to listen to us.
Scott, any
Yeah,
last words there?
Yeah, I echo what Bob had mentioned. I really appreciate everybody's interest. And like we did, we reached out and asked for assistance to people that had worked cases similar to ours prior to us, and that put us in the right direction. So, there's resources out there for you, and seek them out. And the other thing I've been emphasizing this, throughout this question and answer session, but relationships, rely on those, and in everything you do, but in the law enforcement field specifically, and in fire investigations, these are very difficult cases. These are what I think we're talking like a 3 to 5% clearance rate of arson cases in the United States. Not exactly the best odds, right? And so, these are things you're going to have struggles, and from the smallest to the biggest of cases, and you're going to need good people around you and good friends around you. And it's going to be those relationships that you're going to be able to have to rely on to help you get through those. It's very tough times and difficult times. So again, I'm proud of the relationships that I had developed in this instance with this investigation. Still talk to 85% of the people that were on the task force in some form or fashion, mostly through text. But we're 17 years later, so. The relationships you'll have and build for the rest of your life. So enjoy it while you're with them. I know it can become, mundane and daunting and frustrating at times, but these are, your coworkers and the people you're in this game with should be very special and important to you. So enjoy them.
Thank you guys so much.